All right, folks. Thank you so much for being here this evening. I know I've been looking forward to this conversation ever since we set the plans in motion a couple months ago, and I'm so glad to be sharing this program with both all of you and with these two fabulous speakers who are joining us tonight. Before we get started, I want to go ahead and acknowledge that we gather on the traditional lands of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people past and present. Let's take a moment tonight to honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe, a people who are still here, continuing to bring their heritage to light. Acknowledging that we're on native land is just a start. So if you're able, please do consider donating directly to realredduwamish.org to help support Duwamish outreach and cultural life. I want to send a big thank you out to Hanford Challenge, who's kind of been our partner on setting up this event. I'd also like to draw your attention to the fact that they have a booth right here, and anyone who wants to learn more after the talk is encouraged to stop by. They're a national leader working closely with workers and whistleblowers on the front lines of cleanup for a future at Hanford that secures human health and safety, advances accountability, and promotes a sustainable environmental legacy. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to present our two speakers this evening. Liz Mattson has been advocating for a safe and effective cleanup of the Hanford nuclear site for over 15 years. She's a strong advocate of working collaboratively to address the problems posed by Hanford. Liz is passionate about engaging and preparing young people who are inheriting the multi-generational work of Hanford cleanup and nuclear waste stewardship, so they feel empowered to fight for a safer, cleaner future. Liz is Senior Program Strategist for Hanford Challenge. And presenting her book this evening, Shannon Cram is an Associate Professor of Environmental Studies and Science and Technology Studies at the University of Washington, Boston. Her research and writing considers the everyday life of environmental contamination, with a particular focus on the body as a site of politics. Unmaking the Bomb is her first book, and it's a real honor to have her with us this evening. So let's give these folks a round of applause.
It is so exciting to have you all here. I'm just incredibly grateful to see all of your faces, to have you come be part of this conversation with us. This is a huge gift. Thank you so much. And I also just want to say thank you with my whole heart to Hanford Challenge, Brittany, Evan Lindley, Mia Burke, and Liz Mattson, also Nicholas Peterson, who's not here today, for just being incredible collaborators for the work that they do. This book would not be this book without Hanford Challenge. I guarantee that. And so just from my heart, thank you, thank you. Special thank you to Liz Mattson, who I met doing this work 15 years ago and who has become my very best friend. And I often say that my biggest gift from Hanford is Liz. And it just is, part of the ongoing process of doing this work is having close relationships with the people that are also doing it. Companionship and conversation has been a really big part of this project process, so thank you. So what we thought we would do today is I'm going to read just a little bit from the introduction of the book to get us situated all on the same page around the story and what some questions are that are at the center of the book. Then Liz and I are going to have a conversation, some questions, and then we'll open it up to you all to ask your own questions. Is that good? Okay, so introduction on telling impossible stories. Can you hear in the back? Okay, you might need to be.
Yeah, sometimes you're a little far from
this. Okay. It didn't feel very echoey. There you go. How about that? Is that better?
Yes.
All right. Even now, I am tempted to tell you a different story. Good line. One about a dry, windswept place called Hanford in eastern Washington state where they used to make plutonium. I would describe the way it smells there, like warm sagebrush and dust, and paint you a picture of aging reactors glinting in the sun. I would tell you that once upon a time, this was the beating heart of American nuclear weapons production, and now it is one of the most contaminated places on Earth. Now it houses the majority of the nation's high-level nuclear waste. Now it is engaged in one of the largest environmental cleanups in human history. If I told you that story, I would do my best to impress you with the scale of the problem. 56 million gallons of radioactive sludge stored in leaky underground tanks, more than 70 square miles of toxic groundwater, hundreds of contaminated buildings, including 9 reactors and 5 chemical processing plants that dumped about 450 billion gallons of liquid waste directly into the soil. I would mention that even the tumbleweed is radioactive there. So are the coyotes and cliff swallows and rabbits. I would tell you that it's actually someone's job to collect contaminated rabbit droppings and dispose of them in a burial ground on site. And I would emphasize the waste's unruliness, how it ignores the no trespassing signs that mark Hanford's official edges, how it escapes unwinded water currents, stows away in dust devils and groundwater plumes. I would tell you that those plumes flow into the wide blue Columbia River, which arches around the site for 50 miles. And I would add that this river was once the most radioactive in the world. I would say all of this in order to make the case for cleanup. That is really the point of the story I am tempted to tell, first to inspire concern about Hanford and its errant wastes, then to offer a solution. There is a contaminated place. It is hazardous to human health and the environment. We need to clean it up. It's not a hard sell. Even if you hadn't heard of Hanford before you opened this book, you already knew the plot. Maybe you thought about Fukushima as you read, or the Exxon Valdez. Maybe you pictured hazmat suits and birds sticky with oil. I admit the temptation to tell you a story that you already know has something to do with its familiarity. There is a sure-footed confidence to shared narrative. It can be easier to tell a recognizable tale. Plus, I've had a lot of practice. I've been telling that story for almost 20 years. First as a young canvasser going door to door for a political campaign about Hanford's waste, then as a graduate student studying the cultural politics of its cleanup. Later as a university professor teaching classes about environmental health, and as a member of the Hanford Advisory Board writing policy advice about remediation. That story is woven into the fibers of my personal and professional life. I am invested in it. I care about the people and places within it. I tell it in order to advocate for a more just future. And yet, is it too much reverb for you guys? How about this? Better? Awesome. That's good. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Can you hear that?
No.
Now it's off.
Turning it off and on again, so
This. Hello.
Yes.
Test.
Yes, yes.
Bam. Okay. Okay. But now that's kind of reverby. Perfect. Okay. And yet, for most of the nearly 2 decades that I've been telling that story, I have struggled with a sense of duplicity. It's not that the story is untrue per se, it's just not enough. It's guilty of critical omissions, and as its narrator, I am complicit in those erasures. First, and most fundamentally, for example, Hanford will never be cleaned up, if by clean we mean free of its waste. In fact, when remediation is officially complete many years from now, the majority of Hanford's waste will remain on site. There will still be plutonium in the soil and carcinogens in the groundwater. There may still be radioactive rabbits hopping around. The word remediation derives from remedy, meaning to heal or to cure. But the only absolute cure for Hanford's contamination is time. It will take hundreds of thousands of years for its radioactive light to go out. You can't destroy plutonium or dilute it until it ceases to be dangerous. Even small particles of it, taking flight on the wind and landing in a lung, can cause cancer. Cleanup does not attempt to eliminate such particles altogether, for that is not possible. Instead, it promises to monitor and contain these and other toxic materials for a, quote, reasonable amount of time. According to federal regulations, that period ranges from 1 to 10,000 years. Second, cleanup adds containment does not necessarily mean building physical barriers around Hanford's waste or separating it from the environment. Although some remedies involve material interventions like removing contaminated soil from one area of the site and reburying it in a more secure area of the site, others employ non-engineered instruments known as institutional controls. No trespassing signs are institutional controls, so are land use designations that determine what kinds of activities may occur on site. Institutional controls, in other words, often manage humans rather than waste. Third, clean does not mean uncontaminated in U.S. environmental policy. Instead, places like Hanford are considered remediated when they can demonstrate a quote, acceptable risk of exposure-related cancer among the imagined communities that may live, work, and or spend time there in the future. Clean, therefore, is not defined by the absence of waste, but by the relationship between waste and the body. Remediation measures and manages that relationship, titrating environmental contamination with probabilistic human activity in order to achieve legally compliant levels of disease. That temptingly simple version of the story I have been telling for years fails to address these conditions of possibility. Quite the opposite, it frames cleanup as a neutralizing force, implying that one day there will be an after to atomic violence. That story does not explain how some injury and death is built into cleanup's very logic. From a policy perspective, safe is synonymous with reasonable harm. This basic problem, how to talk about Hanford, has long been a source of tension in my work. As an academic, I find it useful to break the story down and consider its parts, exploring its embedded assumptions. There is a contaminated place. What do we mean by contaminated? How should we understand this consequential category in a world saturated with industrial carcinogens and structural inequalities that amplify their effects? What situated histories have produced both the materials themselves and their entangled forms of reckoning? It is hazardous to human health and the environment. What do we mean by hazardous, and for that matter, health, on an unevenly contaminated planet? What specific bodies, environments, and nationalities have come to define those terms? And what is it like to live their definitions? We need to clean it up. What do we mean by cleanup? And how is that meaning informed by our answers to the preceding questions? In other words, how does remediation reflect the powerful social relations of contamination, health, and hazard? Unmaking the Bomb investigates these politics of impact and remedy in the atomic age. It explores how frames like exposure and protection, risk and cancer, reason and practicability recognize and fail to recognize contaminated life. And in considering how such forms of recognition have come to be, it asks if they can be otherwise. So too, this book represents an ongoing effort to understand my own relationship with risk and remediation. In writing this introduction, for example, I went in search of the old research notebooks that I had saved from my master's thesis. The younger self I found in those pages posed eager and impatient questions, determined to identify the answer to Hanford's nuclear waste problem. One set of notes from 2005 described a moment in a public meeting when I strode up to the microphone and demanded that Washington's Department of Ecology director remediate Hanford immediately. My notes include the phrase, "It gave him hell." Reading this description today makes me blush, but I am touched by it as well. One of the gifts that comes with long-term research in a particular place is that field notes and free writes, old calendars, and interview transcripts represent more than a record of research practice and developing ideas. They also illustrate the complex processes and relations of becoming with that place through time. Unmaking the Bomb is informed by my efforts to grapple with Hanford's power-laden logics, my struggle to negotiate the boundaries between research and activism, and my need to reckon with the conditions of living and dying in the nuclear era. In many ways, therefore, this book tells a personal story that weaves Hanford's histories together with my own. And I have grown up with Hanford in ways that I could not have imagined when I started this project. Since that time, every member of my immediate family has gotten cancer, and both my parents have died of it. My father was diagnosed at age 55 and died the same year, soon after I began canvassing door-to-door about Hanford in 2004. My mother was diagnosed at 60, while I was completing dissertation fieldwork about cleanup in 2012. I was diagnosed at 33 in 2014, just weeks after my mother passed away. I spent my final year of graduate school writing my dissertation and applying for professorships, in addition to completing 5 months of chemotherapy and 2 major surgeries that removed my breast, ovaries, fallopian tubes, and a handful of lymph nodes. My younger sister was diagnosed at 31, a few weeks before I finished my PhD. We went to her first oncology appointment together the morning after I graduated. She was diagnosed again 4 years later and successfully completed treatment for a second time as I was finishing the first draft of this book. I include this personal context because my family's experience with cancer has informed how I think about Hanford, the nuclear industrial complex, and the daily politics of toxicity. It matters that the research and writing for this book took place between doctor's appointments, surgeries, chemotherapy infusions, and funerals for 2 of the people that I loved most. It matters that I read studies about nuclear fallout while waiting for biopsy results, and that I traced the history of US toxics policy while leaden with grief. It matters that my research files contain declassified maps of contamination in the communities surrounding Hanford, and that those maps include my mother's hometown. It matters that I want to know what caused my family's cancer. And it matters that I will never be able to fully answer that question. For although most environmental quality standards are based on statistical models of carcinogenic hazard, it is nearly impossible to identify when an individual instance of cancer results from daily life in a contaminated environment. Cancer remains the primary risk factor driving environmental legislation in the United States. It is used to establish baselines for acceptable toxicity concentrations in air, water, soil, vegetation, and bodies, and to determine if those contaminants have exceeded permissible limits. More than any other, this disease has informed the categories we use to define and regulate environmental health, from air pollution in Los Angeles to nuclear waste at Hanford. However, when cancer shapeshifts from a risk metric into a living and dying body, its origin story becomes largely unrecognizable. Instead, individuals with cancer are left to wonder how they could possibly have gotten it. Causation is often framed as a personal failure, the unfortunate and even embarrassing result of poor diet, not enough exercise, too much stress, and so on. I remember feeling this acutely one day when a friend who had learned about my family's history said to me, "Geez, what have you guys been doing wrong?" As anthropologist Lachlan Jane argues, even be-ribbon campaigns that raise awareness and celebrate survivors often narrate cancer through individual struggle and personal accomplishment instead of potential links with environmental exposure. Cancer becomes a passively occurring hurdle to be surmounted by resolve, they write, rather than the direct result of a violent environment. Ironically, efforts to mitigate such violence through regulation and remediation often reiterate this disconnect even as they seek to resolve it. This and other paradoxes integral to environmental cleanup are at the heart of this book. As difficult as it is to admit to my younger self, I do not attempt to solve Hanford's nuclear waste problems here, at least not in the totalizing way I once imagined. In fact, much of my research explores the structural impossibilities of doing that very thing. Instead, I position ambiguity and contradiction as avenues for critical discussion rather than as roadblocks to it. I suggest that uncertainty is more than an absence of knowledge, and that I attend to the social relations of not knowing. Finally, I make the case that improving the terms of cleanup means taking impossibility seriously, asking seemingly basic questions like, how can we regulate a waste form that will long outlast the United States and its regulatory structures? Whom does reasonable exposure protect, and whom does it harm? What does it mean to safeguard individual bodies with regulations that only envision disembodied statistical aggregates? And how have politically and economically tenable solutions come to define the problems of nuclear cleanup and safety? When writing this book, I had the opportunity to interview the former Department of Ecology director that I gave hell in 2005. We had a nice conversation. He was generous and helpful, offering suggestions when I complained about the narrative challenges that Hanford presents. Here's what I think you should write about, he told me. This nuclear cleanup is not only a test of the United States, this is a test of our species. The genie is out of the bottle, and there's no putting the genie back in. Well, he paused and pointed to an old picture of Hanford on the table between us. This is the legacy of that genie. This is a test of our society. Are we really willing to do what it takes to remedy this situation? His question has stayed with me. In fact, since then, I have noticed it being asked frequently, albeit in different forms. It emerges when Hanford managers describe political gridlock and budgetary constraints, and when community organizers advocate for better waste treatment protocols. Indeed, in many ways, are we willing to do what it takes is a very practical question. It invites iterations. How much money is required to make this project work? What kind of regulations would be necessary? Do we, as individuals, nations, and communities, have the resources to make cleanup happen? However, such questions also imply that the bomb can, in fact, be unmade. That if only there were bigger budgets, better technologies, and greater public interest, this situation could be remedied. Yet these same people also recognize the regulatory impossibilities of nuclear waste. They acknowledge that the genie has already left the bottle and that there's no putting it back. To be clear, when I say impossible, I mean both the material challenges of Hanford's cleanup as well as the normative stories we tell about it. I mean that multi-millennial waste will inevitably exceed its physical and institutional containers, and that administering eternity has unthinkable science fiction-like qualities. But I also mean the powerful conditions and contexts that define unthinkability itself. I mean the social politics that designate some impacts as reasonable and others inconceivable, allowing cleanup to distribute survival unevenly. By impossible, therefore, I mean both the concrete and constructed realities of contaminated life and the oft-blurred boundaries between the two. Also, when I say we need to take impossibility seriously, I am not making a case for inaction. On the contrary, I see equitable long-term waste management as essential to a socially and environmentally just future at Hanford. Instead, I argue that improving the terms of cleanup means asking better questions. Rather than are we willing to do what it takes, we should be asking what are the politics of our actions? What are the conditions in which remediation is designed, embodied, enacted, and understood? What infrastructures give these actions power? And what does this tell us about our capacity to create positive change? For that matter, what would positive change look like? Positive for whom? Unmaking the Bomb requires much broader forms of critical engagement. It insists that we reckon with the very meaning of nuclear impact while acknowledging that its unmaking will never be complete. I'll stop there. Yeah.
Next tonight. Is this working now? Oh, that's better. Okay. Yay. Thank you so much, Shannon. And it really is such a joy to be here with you today and celebrate your book. I've witnessed and been with you on this journey, and I'm so proud of you for being here and getting to this day. And thank you for coming tonight. It's so exciting to look out and see all these faces filling this room, and excited to learn about this topic and engage. So one thing I love about your book is how you bring us into this uncomfortable truth that there are no easy answers when it comes to nuclear waste. And I really like how you invite us and introduce us to this messier narrative and help us navigate and uncover and hold these complex histories about nuclear waste. And you have your own embodied history and experience that informs your research, and you talked a little bit about it in the reading that you just did. I think it really brings the story to life, how you weave your story into the book, and it really doesn't read like a traditional academic book. Can you talk about your choice to write yourself into the story and the book's more personal narrative style?
Thank you. Yes. So I was thinking as I was coming today, the sort of synchronicity or the like full circleness of, I actually learned about Hanford on a telephone pole, like literally right outside the store. I was in Seattle for a funeral, unfortunately, and was living in California at the time. I just gone through a breakup. I was having a hard time in life and I did not want to go home to my job there. And my best friend who lived here at the time was saying, like, you can just move in with us. You know, we'll give you a car to use, just find a job. So I gave myself 2 days to find a job, and we walked up and down the app, pulling phone numbers off of flyers on telephone poles. This was before cell phones. And I there was one about an environmental campaign, pulled the little phone number off, walked over to a payphone, called, did an interview, got the job. And it was a political campaign for Initiative 297, which was about waste storage management at Hanford. Because I had a bachelor's degree already, they immediately made me a manager on the campaign because I think it was a canvassing job, and most of the canvassers were like new high school graduates. And so I ended up spending 4 months going door to door, talking to people across Washington about Hanford, a place I had never heard about myself. But has anybody canvassed before? A few? Okay. I don't know if this was your experience, but for us at the organization I was working in, we were not supposed to stray from what's called the rap, which is like a paragraph long spiel that you memorize and say word for word at every door. So I said the rap like many, many, many thousands of times, and I had a couple of answers to regular questions, but in general, that's what I knew about Hanford. I knew this paragraph, I knew a little bit of few answers. I honestly was just doing it not because of passion or anything. I was doing it so I didn't have to live at home anymore. I could live with my friend. And at the end of the summer, I started graduate school at the University of Oregon, and I just like Hanford just kind of stayed in my mind. And I decided to do a tour of the site about a month after graduate school started, which includes the B reactor, the first full-scale nuclear production reactor in the world. And I walked into that reactor and, surprising myself, completely burst into tears. It's a really impactful space. Has anybody been there? I know, Jesse, you have. It's a really impactful space. At least it was for me. It's huge, just visually impactful, but it also felt very emotionally impactful. Just the scale of what this place how this place had changed the world in such a dramatic way. And I went back to graduate school, changed my topic to Hanford, have been studying it ever since. I was 23 at the time, and I'm 43 now. So, and then after that started, I learned that my grandfather had worked there, and my family grew up near it. I didn't know that. That's how often it's the case that people don't know that Hanford even exists. when I give talks about Hanford, I often ask who's heard of it, and it's usually like 1 or 2 people in the room, which is an amazing thing for Washington State, right? Like, it's been a very impactful place in our history and in the world history. So that's one thing I just wanted to say. And the reason I chose to include my personal self in the book is that I didn't want to write this story at a remove. I didn't want to write in some authoritative voice. I wanted the reader to feel what it has felt like for me to try and reckon with something like nuclear cleanup and all of the contradictions and impossibilities that come with doing this work. I wanted you to feel the uncertainty, the frustration, the pride, the nerdiness. Like, I just wanted you to kind of feel like all of those conflicting emotions that come with doing this kind of work. I didn't want to pretend like I had all the answers. I 100% don't. And I wanted to do this with you. I'm asking you to think relationally about Hanford and waste in this book. And so I wanted to write in a way that was relational with the reader. So hopefully that's what your experience is. That was what I was wanting. And then also, as I said in the intro, like what happened to my family, everybody, all of us getting cancer back to back to back, constant cancer for so long. It was very fascinating to me as a scholar and hard to me as a human, I don't know, to be on this advisory board I was on the Hanford advisory board for 10 years, Liz and I run it together, and writing policy advice about cleanup that was trying to achieve a reasonable cancer rate while doing all this cancer treatment all the time. It just felt like I wanted to, it just informed so much about how I thought about this problem, what it felt like to inhabit the contradictions, the sort of like banal violence of reasonable harm as an object of recovery. All these kinds of things made me want to include like my own personal reckoning at the center of this book, because it's been my experience with the topic. So hopefully it allows you as readers to have a similar like relationship with this place that feels real and authentic and imperfect, and yet still makes you want to engage. That's the very hard project of nuclear waste management. It's never going to be done, and you can't stop doing it. So, yeah.
Awesome. I think you do such an effective job of weaving your personal story, and makes it so much more engaging to read. So one of my favorite parts of this book, I started calling the milk letters, which you draw from this really rich nuclear history archive. And the milk letters are part of the archive you stumbled onto, where women are writing, asking how they can keep their families safe from fallout. Should I breastfeed my child or feed them powdered milk? What should I do? How do I keep them safe? Can you tell us more about what you found in the archive and what role those documents played in the book?
Yeah, so the archive that Liz is talking about is at Oregon State University. They have an amazing atomic history archive, and also Linus Pauling, who is an anti-nuclear activist, won 2 Nobel Prizes. His papers are there as well. So I spent months there going through these archives, and one of the things that really struck me about them were the ways that there's this moment in the 1950s where the world is kind of reckoning with contamination on the global scale for the first time. Literally before atomic testing, humans didn't know that we could contaminate the entire world for one spot. We just did not know that. We actually thought that wasn't the case. But because of atomic testing, we can now map radionuclides as they traveled around the world, and we could actually see ocean and air currents for the first time. It was a really big boon for Earth sciences, ironically. And so I was struck by sort of what it was like to inhabit this moment of thinking like, oh my gosh, the whole world is contaminated. The fallout studies they were studying, like, come up with any everyday thing you could come up with: hamburgers, polar bear hair, dandelions, the bones of children. They tested everything they could think of for fallout, and they found it in everything. And in that moment, there was kind of this moment of like, what do we do with this? Are we actually going to kill ourselves off? Like, the scientific community became very concerned. And the National Academy of Sciences convened actually a set of committees to try and determine, like, how much is an okay amount of fallout for us to have or contamination for us to live with. And as I was reading, all these different committee statements, there was one sentence that really stood out to me, which was one committee of geneticists trying to determine a reasonable amount of exposure for people to live with exposure to radiation. They come up with an amount that will still kill, they estimate, hundreds of thousands to millions of people over the course of generations. But they kind of come up with this amount that still feels like an okay, reasonable amount. I know there's a lot of sort of ethical mashing between the debate between these committee members. In the end, they underline in their final report to the public that says, we've come up with this amount, we think this is okay. The quote is, "This is not harmless, mind you, but reasonable." And that making of reasonable harm in this particular moment really stayed with me. And it went on to kind of inform the way that I tried to understand how to reckon with cleanup too. Sort of like, what does it mean to make some exposure and some death reasonable? And what does it mean to inform the very definition of clean and toxics policy based on that amount of death? And what I didn't know going into this research was that actually, the nuclear industry and these sort of reckonings with contamination during the Cold War, actually the logics of that, the sort of cost-benefit analysis, risk-based logics that came out of the fallout science and earth sciences that came with it, went on to inform all of our environmental policy and our toxics policy in the United States. So the language is the same in our laws across, not just in nuclear spaces anymore, because it was adopted by all these other agencies, something that we're all reckoning with, not just at Hanford. What I think I hadn't really realized was sort of the historical nature of how reasonableness as a concept, as a strategic concept that could be sort of manipulated in certain moments to achieve different ends, sometimes for industry, sometimes for public health, how that reasonableness as an idea came to be, and what sort of abstraction of life that required. And so that project, or that sort of thought experiment, travels throughout the book as well.
Thanks, Shannon. At the heart of cleanup is how we imagine the future. What will this place look like when cleanup is done? What does that mean? And can you talk a little bit about how that shows up in your book?
Yeah, so another way that sort of we think about cleanup is by choosing a future that we're trying to achieve with the cleanup. I say we, I don't know, Department of Energy, EPA, Department of Ecology, humanity. This is an uneven thing to say we, right? But one of the things that happens is you sort of pick a future that you're trying to achieve, and then you do a bunch of modeling to make sure that the cleanup that you're doing will achieve a reasonable cancer rate for the people that are gonna live in that future. And so I became very interested in who is living in that future? How do we decide what that future is gonna look like? And literally, whose body is that? What body is it? And went down a lot of rabbit holes about like the meaning and making of that body in those exposure scenarios and those models. In the models, they're called the receptor, which is fascinating anyways. But the receptor itself is a particular body that is also been designed by committee and has a lot of power-related details to it that I can talk about later. But really, like, the project of deciding the future that cleanup is trying to achieve has so much to do with what we mean by reasonable harm. At Hanford, that really matters a lot because the cleanup is trying to oftentimes achieve like an industrial use standard in some areas of the site, which means that no one can live there in the future. And if no one's living on site, then they're a lot less likely to get cancer. If you pick a recreational exposure scenario, people are only on site for like 3 hours a year or something. There's some specific amount. That's also less likely that people are going to get cancer. If you choose a residential standard, for Department of Energy, that means like a suburban standard. There's all kinds of calculations that go into it. You can live according to certain ways, but you can't dig below 15 feet. There's also kind of imaginations of what a suburban life looks like. And then there's also exposure scenarios that have been created by 2 of the tribes that have treaty rights to the site. There are multiple tribes that have treaty rights to the site, and some tribes, one tribe that doesn't have treaty rights to the site, and yet has long-term, current, and historic relations with the site. If you're not picking one of the tribal exposure scenarios, you're not making that life possible according to the kind of cleanup that we're doing on the ground. So what I found was, first, what kind of land use is informing the future use of the site actually determines what cleanup, how much cleanup is being moved around the site and controlled. And also like the ethical manner in which that choice happens, I think is really important and sort of becomes part of the politics of impossibility of cleanup. There's a lot of, unfortunately, discussion about how it's impossible to choose the tribal exposure scenario because that's like not who's gonna live there in the future. There's a lot of assumptions about whose life is possible to protect. And that becomes part of the reasonable harm of cleanup as well. So that's really a big part of the book too, is investigating not only the science of the exposure scenarios and what they assume about the body and everyday life, but also like the sort of broad structural assumptions about power, assumptions about whose life has value that goes into defining clean at the Hanford site. And for me, even though I am very, I have a lot of ambivalence about specific policy, whether it's going to work well, what we're doing, I have ambivalence and uncertainty that comes through in the book. I don't have uncertainty about my ethical commitments. And for me, as a scholar and also someone who's working on this a long time, one of my ethical commitments is that the cleanup choose a tribal exposure scenario and imagine that the people who have long relations and rights to the site, to be in relation with the site forever, are at the center of our imagination when we're doing cleanup. Another ethical commitment I have, and we won't have time to talk about it right now, but is that the workers who are doing cleanup on site are cared for if they get sick. One of the chapters in this book is about workers, chapter 4, and a lot of the people that I worked with and that Hanford Challenge does a lot of work with is workers on the site. If they get sick, there's a whole compensation system that they have to go through in which sort of their bodies get abstracted into statistical data in order to be seen. You have to establish probability of causation to get compensation in all these different ways. I would just love for that to not be the case. Just if you work at the Hanford site, you got sick, let's just care for you and not make you like prove that it was caused by these. I want something so much more radical than like I want care to happen without the requirement of proof. Let's just care for each other and let's pick people who are at most risk of getting cancer from their exposure and center their lives. Then it protects everyone. And so those are two I'm leaving you with this because in the like uncertain, ambiguous, impossible soup of doing cleanup work, there are things that I'm not unclear about. And it feels nice to have those commitments to grab onto. And to feel like some solidity in them, you know what I mean? So I often tell students, like, if you, in my environmental policy classes, if you're feeling like you know for sure what the answer is to this policy question, you're probably not doing it right. Like, feeling some uncertainty is a normal part of doing environmental work, but you don't have to feel uncertain about your ethical commitments, and you can allow those to sort of guide your weighting, your inhabiting the contradictions that are inevitably going to come with doing environmental work. So we should probably open it up to you all.
Yeah, so we're going to open up to you now, and I'll try to repeat your questions so everyone can hear any questions or thoughts or themes that you'd like to hear Shannon talk about,
Or Liz.
or me, or Hanford Challenge. In the back? Yeah.
I have a super simple question.
Can you stand up? We asked it.
Yeah. So I didn't actually know what the Hanford site was before this. So like, where is it, and essentially what is it?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Sure. So if you look over here, there's a map of Washington State. I don't know if you can see. Can you see it from where you're sitting?
You can come over after, yeah.
Yeah. So you can see in southeastern Washington, policy kind of goes through them to make plutonium for nuclear weapons, and made plutonium for over 45 years, and now has been in cleanup for over 35 years. So, Shannon's book is really looking at the cleanup side and how do we do this? How do we protect people in this cleanup, which is so complicated? And when we were making plutonium, we weren't really thinking about, and when I say we, the federal government, scientists, people working on this weren't really thinking about how do we protect the environment while we're doing it. There were a lot of just like, we got to do this fast and now we're paying for the consequences of that. And we're happy to talk to you more about the background of Hanford, but thank you for asking that basic question. Important. Anyone else? Purple side? Yeah.
Hi, I'm curious if you could speak more on the politics of cleanup and its connection to indigenous land back movements and whether that happened in the on the ground organizing, like the solidarity politics and whatnot.
So the question was about the politics of Hanford in the context of indigenous land back movements. It's a really important to not just give the land back unclean, to give the land back, say like, good job, here you have it. You know what I mean? It's important to, if we're considering like, who's going to be in charge of this land, that we do so with resources to continue to manage waste forever. So I just want to make sure that that's clear. I think in other spaces, it could be a tactic to say, wonderful, here's the land back, without providing resources, like you be in charge, without providing resources to continue cleanup and to have cleanup be ongoing. So this land is already in relationship with the tribes in this area. So it is already, there's already rights to use this land in perpetuity. And I think, I don't know if you agree, but I think right now the challenge is for DOE to agree that the treaty rights are valid. Right now the DOE and the tribes have a different interpretation of the treaty rights and what they mean in terms of how the land can be used. And I think in order to ensure this land is cleaned up, to ensure a future for the tribes that are already in relation with the site and have been in perpetuity, we need to actually center those exposure scenarios that the tribes made in order to ensure that that's possible. So that's where I actually don't have a good answer to like land back conversations. The way I'm focusing on it is to say, within the structures that we have now, that we can do right now, is to choose a tribal exposure scenario to ensure that cleanup in this moment is happening to that degree of protectiveness. So I don't know if that's helpful. I don't have the answers completely, but for my own sort of like trying to advocate for the perspective of centering the tribes in cleanup, I usually do it with the exposure scenarios because that's how cleanup is already being imagined, and the tribes have already made exposure scenarios that can be used in those contexts. That feels a little bit safer to me to do rather than to engage in more of a land back conversation, because I worry that the land will be given back without the cleanup being done to that standard. So that might have been a circuitous way of saying, like, I keep going back to the exposure scenario, even though it's imperfect, because I want that level of cleanup to happen with current resources and structure, so it can start happening now. I don't know, do Mia or Brittany, do you guys have? Just knowing that there's some people new to Hanford in this room, the Hanford cleanup is going to take, is expected to take, and the government is saying this, 75 to 100 years to finish. And those deadlines continue to be pushed out. Every time they come back to say, well, we're changing the schedule again, it's always longer and it's always gonna cost more. So this idea, I think it's helpful just to hold that this is a multi-generational project. And when we're done, then Shannon really beautifully talks about this, and it can be a tension in our work sometimes, like, you know, we're saying, do the cleanup. Cleanup's impossible. What does that mean? You know, how do we achieve cleanup that's impossible? But that's part of the by naming that, I think it makes certain things possible. So we're not just walking away and saying we cleaned it up and we're done. We have to manage that waste and remember it forever. And that's this piece, oftentimes some of the tribal elders that have been involved in cleanup and mentored us have joked about, you know, we're going to bury this waste and someone's going to forget about it, and saying, we're going to be here forever. We'll tell you, we'll remind you where it is. And I think that's some helpful context.
Yeah, exactly. When I say like sci-fi timescales, that's a Western epistemology, right? That like thinking intergenerationally and thinking in thousands of years, the tribes at Hanford are already doing that. And that's what Russell Jim used to say. He would say, you know, we've been here for 10,000 years, we'll be here for the next 10,000 years, we'll tell people where the waste is. And so I think that's an important thing to remember as well. And I also will say something I didn't mention earlier about my personal history. Because my family's from the area and my grandfather worked at Hanford, my grandfather helped build the dams in the Columbia River, including the dam that flooded the Waterpump Village, and including the dams that powered the Hanford site. Like my personal family history is part of the settler active, very literal settler colonial history of this place building, you know, the infrastructures that have made the bomb possible. And I never am not thinking about that too. So I meant to acknowledge that earlier. And I think like that's another very important reason that I think for me, centering tribal exposure scenarios in informing cleanup is an important way to address the settler colonial legacies of the site. Any other questions, Front Row?
So in academia, is there progress being made in helping decision makers incorporate these long-term costs upfront in terms of how not to do something? Because, for example, Hiroshima and Nagasaki created these costs as well as the debts, short-term debts. But as we decide what to do next, is there any attempt to anticipate the long-term cost outcomes of our decisions?
You mean financial costs?
Yes. I mean, I know this is a crass question, but ideally one would just say no upfront, right? This isn't worth it. And so is there any attempt in academics to try to create tools for creating a life cycle cost, if you will, across generations? And
That's a great question. For people in the back didn't hear, the question is about, in academic spaces, talking about the cost of cleanup across generations or cost of some of these actions and trying to calculate that life cycle cost.
so that we can change what we decide to do next.
Yeah.
You know, what is the cost of war? If we decide to go to war, it includes these costs. Or nuclear power.
I don't know of specific people in academia who are doing that, but I do know that like there's been many reports, oftentimes like within the National Academy of Sciences or other sort of agency-based or funded committees that are trying to anticipate the costs of cleanup, and they're always changing. I think the most recent estimate was like 640 billion or something like that, and for Hanford. And a cleanup that would last until 2158 or something like that. And I have no confidence that that will be the limit. It changes, it goes up always, every time they do a study. So yeah, but I think your bigger point about like actually reckoning with, addressing, acknowledging the costs of
If we could
war.
figure out upfront. So this would not be Hanford, this would be whatever we're doing next.
Yeah.
Before it happens.
Yeah, because usually we do cost benefit analysis before we choose directions.
Yeah, I mean, how
It's
you,
possible we would do less or do different things if we could anticipate the cost more accurately. And I would say honestly.
yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I feel like we had a good example of that during the Cold War. You know, I mean, where they're saying like, well, we have proven that we have not been good at that project yet. We at Hanford, some of the tanks were only designed to last for 25 years. And then they were like, let's make better ones. Those are supposed to last for 50 years. And they're leaking. So when we're in a wartime context, we have not as a nation proven good at thinking complexly about cost. And in fact, we have done the opposite where we're like, we just need to get through this war. We just need to get through this battle. Let's just get the waste. The waste is just, we'll figure it out later. And then now we're living in that reality. So, I mean, I love the invitation to think in more complex terms about that. Yeah, that's all I can say. I guess that would be great. Yeah.
saw a question. Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you both so much. This is great. So Shannon, I'm curious, I know some academics struggle with this sort of being both an activist, and an actor, and an academic, and I know that you sort of thought a lot about this as you wrote the book. And I'm curious sort of how you came to the perspective through which you wrote about it, you started the book with it, but I'm just curious to hear more about how you found a way to both continue to be sort of part of the process, but also be an observer and an analyst. And I'm just curious how you manage that and how you feel about that now, having written the book.
Great. So the question is about being kind of part of the world and the process of talking about these issues, like Shannon being on the Hanford Advisory Board, being in relationship with all these people, and also doing this research in the academic space. How did that all work?
Yes, I think it's a great question because at first I approached the topic more, I was canvassing, whatever, and then I was only in an academic frame, and then joining the Hanford Advisory Board. Again, I was on the board for 10 years, and then I was in a leadership position on the board for years as well. I really am glad that I was in that policy space, and I intentionally kept re-upping my position on the board, in part because it forced me to inhabit the not just academic critique of doing cleanup. I was really actually benefited from having both roles. I felt like there would be moments where something would happen in a board meeting on in a policy conversation that I was like, ugh. And then I would like write in my notes like about all my social theory, and I would just like academic my way through it and feel like I had something to grab onto. And then there were also times that as an academic, you feel like you're kind of just doing fluffy nothing, and what is this anything? And so it actually really helped to be in the policy space too, as imperfect as it was, because I felt like we were like making concrete suggestions about putting up on the ground. And even if my suggestions were being taken up, I was still there to sort of poke and talk about power and use social theory in a way that like hopefully would inform policy. But I actually came to find that tension to be extremely important and productive. Like being in the how do you hold your critique and attention to power and then still have to make a decision about a specific waste management area where the decision ultimately has to be like 10. Like something so reduced and simplified. That's how this works. And I didn't want to allow myself the privilege sometimes of just sort of critiquing without action. So that inhabiting the tension of critique and action became the project of this book, actually. And it actually found it very rich writing-wise, and I found it really rich as a teacher, too, because that is how it feels to do environmental work. And so Rebecca Solnit says, like, any good activist learns to love paradox. And I genuinely have found that to be the case, too, like developing a relationship with contradiction while still holding your ethical commitments, still working on this project is the thing. And so, yeah, I think that's what it's been for me, is just sort of like the tension that it provided, the opportunity it provided to really be real with how this feels to do. It has been great, actually. Hard, but great.
I think we have time for one more question. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry. Oh, go ahead.
There was one thing that really surprised me when we visited the Hanford site, the longevity of the radiation. And PB-239, the half-life is 24,000 years, which means it would be 48,000 years before the radioactivity is gone. That was such a shock to me, I mean, I'm a radiologist, I did a lot of looking at, but we never dealt with plutonium, so I was really surprised.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I really think it's important to just surface that and say it out loud. Like, 24,000 years as a half-life for plutonium is so long. Yeah, and that's just the half-life. So it's actually much longer than that. We need to be thinking about this. And there's a lot of radionuclides on site that have different half-lives, but they're all pretty long in human timescales. I mean, even if we're talking about strontium, it's still like a couple 100 years, like, that's how old the United States is. Like a couple 100 years is so long. It's not very, yes, but like, I mean, even 100 years is a really long time for regulatory stuff. And that's just the radionuclides. There's lots of forever chemicals at the Hanford site as well. So yeah, I mean, part of working with waste is to think about waste in forever terms and to think about what does it mean to engage with forever timescales. It's part of the process of this. I think we're at time. We have a hard stop here, but we have 30 minutes to just sort of talk individually after this. So yeah, I just want to say thank you so much.
Yeah, and before you clap, just one second. So right after we're done, Shannon's gonna be up here signing books, so you can buy a book if you don't have it. Highly recommend. Shannon will sign it. We're gonna be tabling over here, so Brittany and Mia, my wonderful coworkers, are here to talk to you. We have a mailing list if you'd like to get on it. There's fun stickers. We can talk to you more about some of the Hanford basics, just answer your questions. And I'll be around too, circulating to talk to you. And just for everyone here, it's so important. Sometimes when you hear all of this really overwhelming information, it can be hard to hold that showing up is an important and meaningful act in this space, but it's so important. Just showing up, talking about these issues and getting this conversation circulating is so important. So just hold, like sometimes those simple acts can be really radical in this space. So thank you so much for showing up tonight, and we look forward to talking to you after the event.
Another local allies like